Good evening and welcome to The Journey Home. My name is Marcus Grodi, your host for this program. Each week, EWTN gives me this wonderful privilege of bringing into your homes the stories of men and women who were touched by the Holy Spirit to an awakening of heart and mind to the fullness of the church, a deeper walk with Jesus Christ by becoming a part of the body of Christ, the church. And so I'm particularly honored tonight because our guest, Dr. Peter Huff, former Baptist, didn't have to drive that far to get here from the studios from Xavier University, but he, like so many of the folk that we work with here in the Coming Home Network, I think his conversion had an impact on his vocation, his journey, and how he decided to use the gifts that God had given him in his life in the transition from a Baptist background into the Catholic Church. But of course, that's why we're here tonight, is to hear his story. So welcome, Dr. Peter Huff.
Thank you.
Welcome to The Journey Home.
Glad to be here.
It's good to have you here. And I will mention before we even begin that you have a small little book, Vatican II, its impact on you. And I assume we're going to talk about that later in the program.
Sure, glad
its
to.
Impact on you.
Yes, it has had an impact, yes.
All right.
And on my conversion, too.
Oh, okay. Well, let's, as I usually do in The Journey Home, I get out of the way as soon as possible and invite you to go way back and give us a glimpse of your early spiritual journey.
First, let me say where I am now.
Okay.
I'm a professor of theology and religious studies, and I've taught at a number of institutions, but I'm at Xavier University now, as you mentioned, in Cincinnati, and I hold a chair in ethics, religion, and society, and it's my privilege to teach and study there and interact with colleagues and students. It's a wonderful life.
When you teach courses in that, does that long title kind of boil down to how do you live your faith out there in the real world?
Essentially, I mean, it's talking about the connection between faith and culture, basically.
All right.
For example, I teach a course on C.S. Lewis, and we look at his moral imagination.
Oh, excellent. Okay. All right. Well, my son and I were recently talking about this idea of the impact of technology on our culture and how in our faith, I think Neil Postman pointed out some of the ideas that sometimes we just assume that the technological development is like a God-given part of the culture in which we've been born.
Yes.
As opposed to, no, this is the time we're called to live, but we need to kind of take a step back and see what aspects of our culture are God-given, or do we need to selectively make choices so that we can live our faith in the culture and make a difference in culture.
Exactly.
But that's what you teach all the time.
Right. That's what I do day after day.
Well, good. Welcome to the program. So,
Thank you.
So if you would, you're brought up Baptist, born
Yes.
Baptist?
Yes. Well, Baptists will tell you that no one is born a Baptist. But we know what we mean by that. So yes, I was born into a Baptist home, Southern Baptist, in the heartland of the Southern Baptist Convention. I was in Atlanta, Georgia for many years. And, Martin Marty, the church historian, called the Southern Baptist Convention the Catholic Church of the South. And that was my experience. What he meant by that was that the Southern Baptist faith and culture just permeated every aspect of Southern society. And certainly that's what I experienced. This was the late 50s, all through the 60s, 70s. My entrance into the church, I date 1987. But of course it was brewing for a long time prior to that. But I really grew up in the heyday of the Southern Baptist Convention, the golden age, if you will. Okay. It's changed a lot since then.
You as an individual young man, you were part of that soup of Southern Baptist theology and practice.
Yes.
You as a young man, were you a practicing Southern Baptist?
Oh, absolutely. My family was very active. We were in church multiple days during the week. And on Sunday, of course, it was not a Sabbath rest, it was a marathon. Sunday school, and of course my parents were Sunday school teachers, so we had to get there early for them to get set up. Sunday school, morning worship, run home for dinner in the South, not lunch, you know. and then maybe a quarter of a football game on TV, a little homework possibly, but then back in the evening. And we would have choir practice, youth meetings. We had a evening Sunday school sort of experience called Training Union. And then the evening church service, which would be more evangelistic than the morning. Maybe a youth meeting after that. So after all of that Sabbath, coming home exhausted, ready to start school in the morning. But we were very active. We read the Bible at home. My parents prayed with us. My father was an ordained deacon. My mother not only was a Sunday school teacher, but a librarian in our church. So we were very much church people.
Yeah, and I've envisioned often that the really conservative, theologically conservative Southern Baptists, in that story of the vine and the branches and our need to produce fruit, that the assumption is those fruit are converts.
Yes.
Evangelization.
Yes.
You've received the graces, you've believed, you've been baptized as a sign of your faith. Now it's your job to go out and evangelize and convert others.
Yes, and that was always the message. And that's what we were being trained for in that evening Sunday school called Training Union, the idea that we would be evangelists in our own way. But I think the theology that I got was a strange mixture of things. I wouldn't call it fundamentalist by any stretch of the imagination. So this was pretty moderate form of Southern Baptist tradition that I received. Although, we would have a traveling evangelist come to town or something like that, and we get a more fire and brimstone version. But what we got day after day was pretty moderate Bible piety, with a little injection here or there of more liberal thoughts. Maybe a seminary professor would come preach, and that would sound a little bit different to us. But one thing that eventually, over many years, began to trouble me is I had nothing to judge these theological messages by. We were told that the Bible was our rule. In reality, it was really experience that was our rule. That was the basis for our religious life. So I had no unchanging standard. And years later, that was one aspect of the Catholic tradition that I noticed and then began to attract me.
Now, in your upbringing then as a basic Baptist young man, was the Catholic Church ever mentioned, ever experienced at all by you as a young man there in Atlanta, Georgia?
Certainly not experienced in my day-to-day life. I didn't know a Catholic until high school, and then 2 or 3 possibly. So Catholic culture was very distant from my experience. We would pick up signals in Sunday school, in church, in our youth group, that there was this phenomenon out there called Catholicism, and there were some dangerous aspects to it. And the usual litany, worship of statues, and salvation by works, unbiblical notions about the Pope, etc. But even so, it was still sort of just a warning. There was nothing hardcore about it, so I did not get the fundamentalist message about Catholicism that a lot of Baptists have in other places.
Not so much the Pope, the Antichrist, or...
No, one of my friends said that one time, in maybe 7th or 8th grade, and I had never really heard that before. Right. So it was not the message of the Sunday sermon, certainly.
But really in that Bible Belt, you would not either have experienced Mass or any of the physical aspects of the faith.
There has been a lot of in-migration to Atlanta in the last 2 or 3 decades. But I think I saw one Catholic church on a regular basis from the expressway, one that's downtown. It's still there. Mm-hmm. And in fact, that was the place where I went for my first Mass. Not as a participant, but as a spy. All right. But would not see Catholic churches, would not see Catholicism in operation at all.
Until later.
But the place where or the way I really started to see real live Catholicism was through travel. And my father worked for the airlines. He worked for the airlines for a number of decades and took early retirement, and then became a full-time minister of education in our Baptist church. But while he was with the airlines, he had international meetings, and he would drag us along with him. And when I was in 8th grade, we went to Italy and to Greece. And so I think I saw a little of Eastern Orthodoxy, now that I look back on it. But I definitely saw a good dose of Catholicism. And it really struck me. We went to St. Peter's, and I know that hundreds, thousands of American Baptist tourists go to Rome all the time. It's just something to check off on the itinerary. But something clicked with me. And at that time, I couldn't have really put my finger on it. But, we talk about picking it up in the water or something like that. Some sort of germ was really planted in me.
Well, and with what you teach now, religion and culture,
yes,
that as a young 8th grader going, I can imagine being plopped out of Georgia and dropped into Rome, St. Peter's,
yes,
that it would have been difficult to know where does the religion stop and start and the culture stop and start. I mean, it's a different, complete world.
Yes.
Than what
and
you would have
in
seen.
a sense, that was attractive to me because I saw behind the church this grand civilization.
Yeah.
And I remember distinctly feeling that I was sad that I was looking in from the outside. Somehow I wanted to be part of all of that. And already, music was a major part of my life, and along with music, art history. So I was kind of a bookish, 8th grader looking at art history and that sort of thing. And so to go to Rome then and to see Catholic culture and civilization, that was just as impressive as maybe the spiritual aspects that I was picking up on.
Yeah, I don't mean to sound demeaning at all, but if you're interested in art history and you decide to look at Southern Baptist art history, what is there?
An illustrated Bible here or there, and the pictures of Jesus on the wall in the Sunday school room, but never in the church.
Right.
So you can have an icon of sorts in the educational room,
Yeah.
but in the church we did not have, of course, any sort of image. We didn't have a cross.
Yeah.
So it was very
In fact, when you think
traditional.
of Baptist cultures, in some places Baptist culture almost carries with it the idea that there is no movies, there is no this, there is no that, even sometimes a squelching of a view towards higher education. It's not true across the board
Right,
in Baptist,
right.
but again, in some...
And my experience was more liberal, if you will, in the sense of emphasizing education. We always had seminary-educated pastors, and our musicians were classically trained. So we had sort of the cream of the crop, if you will. And to some extent, that prepared me to think about, well, where did all of these hymns come from? And I never asked quite where did the Bible come from, but I was close to that. And I was primed, if you will, to be prepared to think about a greater tradition behind it all. And eventually, baby steps and just a lot of good luck and the grace of God, I was able to find out where I was headed.
Now, your dad was there, a deacon, right?
Yes,
In the Baptist
yes.
church and active. Did you sense any of that call for yourself as a young man?
Yes, I did. And, it was a very genuine call. I had a lot of good models. And I knew early on that somehow I was to be an active Christian. We talked about going into full-time Christian service in those days. So that was the phrase that would be used. Of course, I had a conversion experience and walked the aisle like thousands, millions of Baptists. And then I would walk the aisle again, rededicating my life as is done in that culture. And at one point, even said that God was calling me to be a missionary And that understanding, I think, has evolved over time, but that's the way I understood it. So I did feel some sort of call to ministry, and got involved in youth leadership, follow the usual path. And during college, was a part-time youth minister in another congregation, and then decided to go to seminary, and went to Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky, which it was the original Southern Baptist Seminary, and it's always been seen as kind of the flagship seminary of that world. It has changed dramatically since I was there, and I was there in the early 80s during a time of great tumult, really. Most of my professors were, they would have described themselves as moderate. That was the phrase used at that time. They were certainly using the historical critical methods, and that's what I was trained in at seminary. But there's been a great shift in the ground in Southern Baptist culture since those days. But I received a wonderful education at
Did you
the
feel
seminary.
that the shift is in a more progressive direction? I've kind of lost track.
Well, in terms of the
back to a
seminary
more
itself, the seminary has shifted much more toward conservative Orthodox position, which now, as a Catholic, I look upon as a very interesting phenomenon. We have a generation of Southern Baptist seminarians who are very interested in the Church Fathers. In my day, we did not read the Fathers. We were working on biblical studies, and I was leaning more toward church history, but we certainly did not deal very much with the early centuries. Church history began for me with Martin Luther, and then took it to the present day.
Yeah, it's interesting that Pope Benedict, back when he was Cardinal Ratzinger, gave a speech on biblical interpretation, and he points out that one of the problems with the higher critical is an assumption, besides the discontinuity between the old and the new, that this assumption that in history the simpler is more ancient, and anything more developed is by therefore definition older. And so therefore there's a kind of a looking down on any of the early church fathers and any of that for simple, undeveloped, as if we're more intelligent now, 2,000 years later.
Exactly.
And so when you see a movement away from that, you would then, almost by definition, be a hunger for the early and recognizing that I don't think we're all that more intelligent than Thomas Aquinas.
I don't think so. There is a lot of chronological snobbery. That's the way C.S. Lewis puts it. And when I read Surprised by Joy, just to go to C.S. Lewis a minute, when I read Surprised by Joy as a Baptist, I knew that Lewis was onto something in the sense of just exposing our hypocrisy, our superiority, which has no basis. That somehow we are smarter in the 20th, 21st century than anyone in the Middle Ages or the early Christian centuries. So it has taken me a long time to really undo that.
But you came to that while you were still a Baptist.
Yes. But it's funny, I'm thinking about my journey to the Catholic Church. There are other parallel journeys in the sense of what to do with that critical approach to Scripture. That also needs to be nuanced and addressed. But that took longer. So I came into the church, just to get ahead of my story a little bit, I came into the church, but then in my post-conversion years, I've had to go back and look at critical methods, assumptions that were just sort of drilled into me early on, a suspicion of the supernatural, etc. So my conversion to the church, is one wonderful step, but my post-conversion experience has really been opening up to the beautiful Orthodox tradition that is the mainstay of the church itself.
You're touching on something, Peter, that we in the Coming Home Network are even becoming more and more aware of as we deal with clergy and academics who come into the church that are often blind to the baggage they bring with them.
Yes.
And so conversion isn't just this one time. Even as a Baptist, coming forward and kneeling and saying a Jesus prayer isn't just the end of conversion.
Right, right. But often, of course, it's treated that way.
Yep.
And I think, strangely enough, I brought a Baptist notion of conversion with me into the Catholic Church. And I had to slowly look at that critically, undo it, take it apart, and see what a Catholic notion of conversion truly is. Not to discount my step into the church, but to realize that it is an ongoing process. And I did bring so much with me.
Yeah.
A lot of good. And you can probably tell that I have an affection for my Baptist evangelical past. You know, I love it. Right. So I tried to bring all that was good there with me. But I also brought a lot of intellectual assumptions, which are just, of course, aggravated given my job. You know, I'm in the academy, where those critical assumptions are really part of the professional atmosphere, even among Catholics. So to rethink those and to critique criticism is an uphill battle.
Yeah. That's a place where God's called you to serve.
Yes.
I mean, that really is
Yes.
that. It's not a mission field in the sense that you're better than these guys, but it's really how can you use what God has allowed you to see to help them come to discover? Because that, I mean, you and I share a lot in that, in terms of even with higher criticism, some of the things we learned that are just a part of our thinking.
Yes.
We live in a culture that believes in progress.
Yes.
A lot from H.G. Wells and some of those. Where'd that come from? What's it based on? How do we examine that? How do we step apart from it? I mean, that's what you work on. That's what you teach all the time.
Yes. And often that's our operative philosophy of life. And it may be coated over by a little Christianity. Certainly as a student, I think that was my case. I had become pretty thoroughly secularized in my worldview. And I had an expression of that in Christianity, and I was devoted to life in the Protestant church. There was no question about that. But there was a certain level of skepticism and even a certain dimension of agnosticism, sort of pretending as if God did not exist and sort of working on our own power. So
get into a position where we're talking about God.
Yes.
Studying about
Yes.
God, studying about Christianity. It's safe, but it's out there.
Right.
And we can in time become detached from it. It doesn't examine us, which what C.S. Lewis was all about, was getting at, turning it around and examining who you are.
Yes.
And your convictions.
And he's been a great model for me in the sense of, this great intellectual saying, sooner or later you have to come down to it, is the New Testament true or not? Does what it says about Christ, is that true or not? So that's the fundamental question for me. And if I'm having, this new life after conversion, then that's really the story, for the last few years that I've been working on.
So you're a Baptist in seminary, and an ordained Baptist pastor?
Well, I was licensed to preach, as we said in the Baptist tradition, and had a number of part-time positions, youth work, even music, education, but I'd never served as a full-time pastor. And I think one thing that kept me away from that was this doubt in my mind about where I ought to be, a question in the back of my mind. The Catholic germ had been growing, over time. And my seminary in Kentucky was just a few miles away from Gethsemane Monastery, where Thomas Merton was.
That's right.
And actually, a couple of my professors knew Thomas Merton. So Catholic devotional classics and Catholic spirituality came into some of our coursework. And I started gravitating more and more to the mystical side, the spiritual side, the devotional side of the Catholic tradition. And
There's not a lot of that in Southern Baptist theology.
Yes, that's right. And I could have stopped there. And I could have imitated my professors. I could have become, and I was for a while, an ecumenical Baptist who loved the Catholic tradition. I could have stopped there and probably had a pretty satisfying life and career. But luckily, I didn't stop, and something kept pushing me. And it was that sense of identification. You know, that 8th grade boy looking at St. Peter saying, I want to be on the team that owns this, you know? I don't want to just admire it from the outside. I want to be part of this team that produced it. So that was
The spark that was kind of always
and
there.
eating away at me. And of course, bringing me into great agony. I'm sure many of your guests will tell you, and you know yourself, that it's a painful experience when you know that you are actually moving farther than you ever imagined. And I was operating in the dark. Somebody like Thomas Merton would have been my only model. So I thought, well, you become converted, you enter the church, and then you become a Trappist monk. You know, that's the way to go. And, you know, part of me said maybe I should.
But you were not aware of other clergy becoming Catholic?
No, not at all, not at all. I guess I knew some historical examples here or there.
Newman or someone like that.
Certainly, yeah, Newman. I had not read Newman at that point, but knew figures like him. And Merton himself, of course, as not a clergyman, but as a convert. So I did have a few models of conversion, but all in books. This was a conversion that took place in a library. And in a sense, I hate to say this, but if I had known a lot of Catholics, I don't know if I would have converted. So there is this strange phenomenon of being lured by the doctrine, by the authority, by the sacraments, by the church, by the history itself, and to some extent being turned off a little bit by some of the popular culture. You know, I don't do bingo or anything like that to this day. It's a little foreign to me. And I
Especially you wouldn't as a Southern Baptist.
well, yeah, I don't gamble. So, you know, that's part of the tradition that I brought with me.
Peter, let's take a break now. Let's
Sure.
come back because you've left us at an interesting place in that you really don't know that many Catholics. You
Right.
know maybe a few Baptists that are flirting a little bit with Catholic mysticism.
Yes.
But other than that, it's just what you see in books.
Right.
So let's talk
Right.
about that when we get back
Okay.
from the break. See you in a bit. Welcome back to The Journey Home. I'm Marcus Grodi, your host. Dr. Peter Huff is our guest. And you've left us in your journey where you're being drawn by, again, the seed of your experience as a young man when you visited Rome. This culture, it isn't just the faith doctrine. It is a whole big picture that you saw as a young man
Right.
that was different than the world you were a part of in the Southern Baptist Bible Belt of the Southern United States. And there was a sense in which, I want to be I don't just want to be looking from the outside in. And then, of course, you're reading it and you're discovering this while you're still in Baptist Seminary.
Yes.
Are you teaching at this point?
No, not teaching yet, but working in a church part-time. I was the music minister. And, as I've indicated, when you get deep into music, church music, you eventually hit Catholicism.
Yeah.
So the mystery to me is why every church musician does not come to Rome. But you never know what's going on.
Yeah.
But for me, even that musical path led me to Rome. So church history.
Although I got to add, it still amazes me why some good Catholic musicians end up leaving Rome.
Yeah, that's a whole different story.
Right, where they're going musically. It's like, you've lost track of the great foundation to your tradition.
And I'm not talking about guitars in my situation. I'm talking about the classic tradition.
Yeah.
Always going backward. And eventually all of these avenues, all roads lead to Rome. And it was certainly true in my experience. So yes, I'm in seminary, mainly focusing on church history, historical theology, and working in a church, a Baptist church, in the musical area. And in fact, this was one place where I guess what was going on inside me was obvious, because I was introducing Advent and Lent. In Baptist churches, like a lot of churches, the musician has a great deal of control over the liturgy, if we can call the Baptist service the liturgy. So I guess had somehow talked the pastor into, well, let's try Advent as kind of a build-up to Christmas, and let's try Lent as a build-up to Easter. It sounded logical, just because you need sort of this preparatory period. My mistake was to actually call those seasons by their names. So call them Advent, call it Lent. And I remember one member of the congregation wrote a note to the pastor and said, this seminary boy that you have leading the choir is leading us to Rome. And I denied it, when he came to me. I said, oh, no, this is just, part of the Christian tradition, etc. Episcopalians do this all the time. But in a sense, somebody, I think, had...
You might have had an ex-Catholic Baptist picking up on something.
That's true. We did have some. There are always
of course.
some.
Of course you're going to have those, because that's what you would have been more familiar with Catholics that had become Baptist, and maybe even now we're more anti-Catholic than your average Baptist.
Exactly.
Because of where you'd come from. Yeah. You'd also fascinate me what you'd said about if you had known many Catholics, that might have been a discouragement to your journey. And that might be worth talking a little bit about, because it isn't always that. Certainly sometimes Catholics can be bad Christians, as there are Christians that can be bad.
And
anybody can. But often a good Catholic does not look very Christian to a good Baptist.
Right.
The practices and things.
Yeah. As I said, I did not inherit a great deal of anti-Catholicism in my Baptist world, but I think I did pick up on the stereotype that especially Catholic young people might not be living up to their faith.
Yeah.
I didn't know enough to really make a judgment. I didn't have any facts, but I had stereotypes to work with. I did, though, go snooping in Catholic churches a little bit. And I'll just tell you one example, because I think every convert has a first Mass story of some sort. So this was 9th grade for me, if I can go back. So something was kind of brewing in high school, just raising this interest. I was even reading a little bit of St. Augustine and a life of St. Francis. So getting a little bit into the lives of the saints and a little bit into theology. And so I knew that there was such a thing as a Mass, and I should probably see one sometime. I'd seen, by the way, Pope Paul celebrate Christmas Eve Mass on our little snowy black and white TV, getting that UHF channel on Christmas Eve. So as a young high school student, I'm tuning in the Vatican, seeing the Pope say Mass. And, I couldn't make it all the way through. I got bored, halfway through. But I knew that there was something there to the liturgy, to the sacraments, and I needed to see it
and you would
in
have
real
seen
thousands
thousands of people gathered.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So very impressive sight. So I think it was between 9th grade and 10th grade, the summer between those grades, I had a job in downtown Atlanta. Took the bus in all by myself, had my job, and I knew that it was close to this Catholic church that I had seen hundreds of times from the expressway. So before I went to work one time, I went to this church, Sacred Heart Church in Atlanta, Georgia, still there, has these twin spires that you can see from 75, 85. And went in, this was early morning, so just went in. I don't think I really prayed, but just sort of soaked up the atmosphere a little bit. And that was enough at that time, just getting a little Catholic atmosphere. I remember being very impressed with the poor box. As Baptists, we did not talk about the poor. We talked about evangelizing everybody,
Right.
but we did not have any sort of social conscience. So I was impressed with that poor box, and of course I was reading St. Francis, and that connected. Then I said, well, I've got to come back for Mass. So I figured out I could make it over for a noon Mass. So I went in. I don't know if I tried to genuflect or anything. I just sat down, like a good Baptist in a Catholic church. And then I noticed that as the Catholics were coming in, they would take a host from one container in the aisle and place it in another container. Everybody would take a host, put it in this other container. I didn't know what was going on, and I didn't know it was the host, but
Right.
I knew it was bread for communion. So then the Mass started, and I was able to follow along in a book. And then we came up to the Eucharist, and then I saw the offertory come down the aisle, and I realized every practicing Catholic had put a host in that container. There was one missing, and there was one additional person, and it was me. And I knew that the priest was going to count them, and he was going to know there was some sort of intruder who doesn't belong here. So I got up and left. And then years later, I read in the 7-Story Mountain, Thomas Merton does exactly the same thing in New York City, his first Mass, just as an observer. He gets cold feet at the Eucharist and bails out.
Wow. It's a different world.
But it was a whole different world.
Whole different world.
But I remember telling my parents, I went to Mass. That was something they could not process. And God bless them, they took it in stride. Here's another 9th grader doing kooky things. This one goes to Mass,
Yeah.
or half of a Mass.
Well, when you're in seminary, are you starting to explore again?
Yes. When possible. And also I'm looking at other denominations. So something inside me told me that I was not really destined to be a Baptist minister or professor, like my models had been. But maybe I would be more at home in the Presbyterian Church, Lutheran Church, Episcopal Church, perhaps. So for a Baptist, I had two big steps toward the Catholic Church. I think a lot of Protestants, they may not see it this way, but if they're in a Reformation denomination, like Lutheran Church or Episcopal Church, then they have one step to Catholicism. I really had two, in a sense. So the discovery of the Reformation tradition and a creedal Catholicism with liturgy that you find among the Lutherans and the Anglican tradition, I was thinking, well, maybe this would be Catholic enough. Because I knew if I became Catholic, everything would be different.
Yeah.
And I was not prepared for that. So while keeping the Catholic thought sort of warm in my mind, on a more practical level, I was actually going to clergy in these other denominations and basically saying, what do I need to do to become an Episcopal priest? Could we take care of that today, or maybe come back tomorrow, and and then I'll be happy. But luckily, by the grace of God, that did not happen. And I went into more graduate school.
Okay.
Went to Indiana University in religious studies, working more on church history, especially American church history. And so to some extent could put the church activity to the side. I was a full-time student working toward an academic career. In a sense, that gave me the opportunity to think more clearly about my own spirituality and figure out, where was God leading me? What was this story with a little bit of Catholicism here or there? What was that really all about? So that's when I took the plunge, if you will, and decided during graduate school at Indiana that I need to now seriously start having discussions with a real live priest. I need to go to a real Catholic parish and start to meet some of these Catholics that I've never met because I love their tradition.
It's only on paper, it's only intellectual.
Yes,
that's really
this was a paper trail that I was following, but it was not dry. I mean, it was lively, it was exciting, it was a great adventure of ideas, and my heart was deeply involved in it. It was a warm paper trail, if you will. So this was not some sort of detached research project that I was involved in. But still, I could have stayed in the library. I could have become a connoisseur of Catholicism. But at that point, I realized this has to be my life. So, like a number of seekers, I did go to the rectory, knock on the door, say I need to talk to a priest, and just started that way. So was able to find a good priest who I think could kind of figure out where I was and what the issues were that I was dealing with. And so, took me at that point, tried to understand my story. He suggested I go to RCIA, and here's where I still had some snobbery. I went to one meeting. I said, well, I don't think I'll be going back. I said to the priest, can't we do this ourselves? So he knew that I might bolt, if we didn't do that. So he encouraged me to certainly attend Mass and to get involved in the parish as much as I could. But he realized that maybe at that point the RCIA atmosphere and the message was not what I needed at the time. So he wisely said, well, let's meet on a regular basis.
Every RCIA program isn't the same as every other.
That's right. They're all different.
That's right.
And I have since then, of course, contributed to such programs and see them as very valuable,
right.
And I'm very happy to be a part of them. But at that time,
you had a priest that was able to work with you?
Had a priest who could do it for me. And so at that point, I knew that this was my destiny. And to make a long story short, Easter Vigil, 1987, I'm received into the church. And I was 29 years old at the time, and it's been about a quarter of a century, we'll put it in those terms, that I've been Catholic.
Now, was there any particularly big hurdle for you to get over in becoming Catholic from your Baptist background? What was maybe the biggest for you, do you think?
I don't think there really was a big hurdle because it seemed so gradual. The hurdle was not really with the church, it was in me. As I've said, I don't know if I was really a pure evangelical Baptist at all, certainly by this point. I had really become secularized. So I had a secular worldview with an evangelical Christian veneer of sorts, which a lot of people have.
Yeah.
So the
Far
hurdle,
more than they realize.
the hurdle was really within me, in the sense of what I had come to believe was that I make decisions based on my own rationality, based on a then 20th century perspective. And if anything troubled me about the Catholic Church, I guess it was moral teachings that seemed out of touch with reality. So I had to slowly see the wisdom of the Church on all aspects. I guess I was gravitating more toward doctrine, theological doctrine, and liturgy, sort of pretending like the moral aspect was not there. I could supply a secularized morality, if you will. So that was not solved by entering the church at that moment. It's really taken years as a Catholic for me to realize that we call it the Catholic tradition for a reason. It's all-encompassing. There's not some aspect of life that's left out that we can improvise.
Yeah, they talk in the Vatican II documents in Scripture study about the need, when you study Scripture, to study it in the light of the whole living tradition of the Church, in the context of the entire Scriptures, but also in the analogy of faith.
Yes.
Because it fits together.
Yes.
It really fits together. And
of course, I was trained to study the Bible and separate that from spirituality. And it was hard to undo that training. And confirmation was not enough. I was in the church, but that doesn't mean we're perfect Christians,
right,
Catholics at all, but we're in the right church. But then the conversion moves ahead, and I have to realize, how do we read the Bible? How do we read the Bible through the eyes of the church, listening to the voice of the church? This is not a lone student investigating an ancient text, but I'm reading this book essentially produced by the Holy Spirit and the church, and I have to read it in that context.
Did you find that your position as a professor then, so when you came into the church, were you...
I was a graduate student.
Okay.
All right? And then had to get a doctoral degree, if I were to continue on this academic path, and went to my first Catholic school. So, of course, all of this, has been involved in either Protestant or state secular institutions. So I went to St. Louis University, Jesuit institution, and got my PhD in historical theology there. So that was my first Catholic institution, really, to be a part of and be trained there. And by the way, that's where I met my wife.
Okay.
And she was also studying there. She was raised a Catholic. And so we were both interested very much in American history and American literature, and in my case, the American Catholic story. And so we were able to meet each other actually in the classroom. But that institution was my first Catholic institution. And then, moving into an academic career after that. And it seems like it takes me a long time to learn these things, but I had to learn slowly how to be a Catholic theologian.
Yeah.
At first, I think I was a Protestant theologian who became Catholic. And I had sort of continued along that path for a long time. I was still kind of a secular Protestant theologian who happened to be a member of the Catholic Church.
I was going to say, you said you had this, you had become a secularized with a veneer of Protestantism.
Yes.
Was this a veneer of Catholicism on top of that for a while?
I guess. I didn't see it like that at the time, but it had to be something like that.
I think that's more valid than a lot of people want to admit about themselves.
Oh, yeah.
Because we bring a lot of stuff
Yes.
with us. And this could be true for a lifelong Catholic. They can pick up stuff all along that gets built into a wall that protects us.
In fact, many of my Catholic colleagues, Catholic students, will bring that sort of secular orientation. And, you know, I have to say, well, I know exactly what you're talking about because I was there. Let's see what the wisdom of the church actually is.
Yeah, yeah. Because what I was then going to ask earlier is, did you find that your responsibility as a teacher, responsible for what you're teaching, was one of the things that awakened you to the continual conversion for you?
Very much so, especially honesty in the sense of teaching what the church teaches. And I can't tell you how long it took me to get that. It's embarrassing. But there's so many discordant voices, you know, in the church. And of course, in Catholic institutions, educational institutions, we pick up so many different voices from outside and import them in. So it's hard to discern the difference between what has been brought in without baptism, if you will, you know, and what's part of, you know, the tradition itself. Now, the genius of Catholicism for me is that we can bring in everything. You know, we can sanctify it, we can baptize it, transform it. So wherever there's truth, wherever there's any goodness, wherever there's any holiness, as Vatican II teaches, you know, we can bring that into the church. And Thomas Aquinas.
If it's true.
If it's true, it's
true. I mean,
yes.
And that took me a while, even in my own journey, to recognize that something, like we say, the church is teaching on contraception. It isn't true because the church teaches it's true. The church teaches it's true because it's true. And that's the discovery, the journey, right? I mean, discovering these issues. And in some sense, it's almost like Newman. I think Newman himself, a lot of his conversion was like yours. He didn't know that many Catholics.
Yes.
He discovered it in his own studies of the early church fathers.
And it was private judgment, he says, that brought him to the church.
Yeah.
But then he had the wisdom to say, now we go with the judgment of the church, of the tradition.
I wonder if some of this, your own then discernment process of your own continued conversion was what led, for example, to your book, Vatican II, its impact on you. Is that part of the reason you did this?
Very much so. When I was a Baptist seminarian, as you know, you have to get involved in some ministry during that time. And one thing that I was doing was working as a chaplain in a hospital, a Catholic hospital. And already, you know, I wanted to be as ecumenical as possible, so I found the priest chaplain at this Catholic hospital, and said, I want to know more about the Catholic tradition. What should I do? He said, why don't you read the documents of Vatican II? Well, that's a brilliant idea. I never thought of that. We had talked about Vatican II.
Sadly, so many others have not yet thought about that either.
You know, we talked about Vatican II in seminary, and it gets 15 minutes in the church history survey, but it never dawned on me to actually read the documents. And they're certainly daunting. You know, I got the volume and all right, I'll read some of this maybe. But I did start to read them. And to some extent, reading Vatican II was a great contribution to my own conversion and continuing to my Catholic life today. So in my book, I want to share that experience and introduce the beauty and the truth and the wisdom of those documents to newcomers to the church, converts, catechumens, but also practitioners who have been around a while, have heard of Vatican II a lot, but have never delved into the wisdom of it.
Well, Peter, thank you very much for your book and your time. The time has gone too fast. I've got about 10 other questions I want to run by you, so we'll have to do it another time. But thank you very much for your witness, and also your constant witness as a professor in a Catholic institution, yet still fighting battles.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Oh, yeah.
You still got to defend the faith even within a Catholic school today to bring back the truth of the church. Not just in name only, but
that's right.
But in really what she stands for. So thank you very much.
Thank you
for sharing with us on the journey home.
My pleasure.
And again, the book by Dr. Huff is Vatican II, Its Impact on You. So thank you for joining us on this episode of The Journey Home. God bless you. Look forward to seeing you again next week.